The Buckeyes have arrived, of course. Everything's perfect. Everything's fine. Or is it? We will delve into the personnel and the preparation for Northwestern and beyond right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by for Buckeyes Live. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. Tony Gerdeman right next to me. Buckeye Huddle. Lock it in. The Buckeye Weekly Podcast. That's a place to be. If you're behind, you've never checked them out, just do it right now. This is a great time to do it. Northwestern, Indiana, Michigan. Got the important one against Indiana. Then, of course, the cakewalk to close things out. But the big game against Indiana is coming up soon. Tony, how you doing?
Doing well, Mark. Looking forward to that one. Another noon kick. I know everybody's excited about that. Cannot get enough of the big noon. It's the best thing going these days.
There you go. Oh, I think we've got a visitor checking in. Steve, how's it going?
I'm doing great, guys. What's going on?
Steve Hellwagon, everyone. Bucknuts, 247 Sports. Well, we were just preparing for like 55 solid minutes of Northwestern breakdown from you, Steve.
Oh, man. I don't know that much about Northwestern to fill 55 minutes.
I don't think any of us do.
I can tell you that Ohio State and Northwestern, their last game was against the same team. Northwestern defeated Purdue 26-20 in overtime 2 weeks ago, and Ohio State this past Saturday beat Purdue 45-0. So I don't know if you want to compare those scores. I don't know if they have any other common opponents, but my guess is if they did, Ohio State beat those teams by a wider margin than Northwestern did. But that would take some advanced preparation for me to look through and see what that is.
They have played. They lost 40-14 to Iowa right before the Purdue game. It was interesting. I was like, I should probably watch some Northwestern. I haven't watched them at all. And then I'm watching them against Purdue. I'm like, oh, yeah, I watched this. I've already seen this. I watched this in preparation for Purdue, and I had forgotten that I'd watched it because it's kind of I guess that's indicative. That's a good descriptor of Northwestern a little bit, is that they are somewhat forgettable. They'll run two quarterbacks like Ohio State has seen in the past however many weeks now, and well, they won't necessarily see it next week, but they'll probably see it against Michigan. So that you got the running quarterback and you got the less running quarterback. I don't know that either of them are necessarily the throwers, but so you've got that, and it's not a great offense for Northwestern. It's not a very good defense. They are somehow 4-5, but I think that's indicative of the lower half of the Big Ten, because I guess everybody is lower half of the Big Ten outside of the top four, right?
Well, Northwestern seems to have like an exposure rate of, especially when Pat Fitzgerald was there, that nobody pays attention to him. And then the last weekend of the season, people start commenting and figuring out, oh, Northwestern could make it to the Big Ten championship game. And then they're there and they lose by 3 touchdowns, and then nobody remembers them. And then during the offseason, people will talk at times about what a great coach Pat Fitzgerald is. And then we start the next season and it's kind of this sleepy, nobody pays attention to him. And unfortunately, last year, of course, they were coming off 1-11 in the big debacle and fiasco with Fitzgerald, and David Braun takes over. But Iowa took command of the division, so they just kind of laid low and they were out of it. Nobody talked about them. Then everybody at the end of the season kind of realized Northwestern's they're decent. This is kind of remarkable. They went 8-5. They beat Utah in a bowl game and talked about them for a few days, and then back to obscurity.
They go to the Big Ten championship game twice, in 2018 and 2020. In 2020, the COVID year, they gave Ohio State a really tough game there. I think they lost by 3 touchdowns. The other one, that was kind of the Terry McLaurin showcase at Lucas Oil Stadium game, as I recall. And Northwestern had that little pocket of 5,000 people over in the corner on their sideline, that was for them. And then whatever else was there, most of them were Ohio State people. Just as I feel it will be on Saturday at 11 a.m. Central Time. They drew 41,000 people they've played 3 games there since 2010, and they drew as many as 41,000 people, I think, for one of those 3 games. And my guess is the Ohio State people have come in and bought up about 25 or 30,000 of those tickets and will overrun Wrigleyville early and late on Saturday with the revelry. And I mean, you get to go to the Wrigley bars and watch college football for the rest of the day. That seems like a lot of fun. So yeah, too bad we'll be working, Tony. But it is what it is.
There'll be a lot of Buckeye fans there that do not have tickets that are just going to be in and around the area, and
Yep.
you may
Hanging
hear them
out.
from the rooftops as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know if Northwestern has played any more games or any other games at Wrigley this year? Because obviously they
No.
made the right decision that,
This is
okay,
the
this
first
is the
one.
team that we moved to Wrigley Field, because otherwise they're playing like in their little soccer field on the corner of the lake in front of 8,000 people.
They couldn't until the prospect that the Cubs could be in the playoffs. Which maybe you knew that in August, but at any rate, they can't schedule any October games there because you'd have to transfer it over to football back to baseball. They don't want to do that. So they're limited pretty much to November games at Wrigley Field. And so they've got this one, and they will play Illinois in 2 weeks, the final week of the season, which that's kind of a fitting one for them to play Illinois, their rivalry game there in Chicago. They've played 3 games there previously. They're 0-3 all-time at Wrigley Field from my crack research staff. And there was one of them in 2010. I think the first one was against Illinois in 2010. And then there have been a couple of them, I want to say like 21 and 23, something like that. They've played there and lost both those games as well. So, so it'll be a unique setting. I mean, when you think about it, our country, we've got, hang on one second. I need to go. You guys take it for a minute and I'll come back with a couple of thoughts on Wrigley, but.
No, I'm definitely looking forward to it. They'll be the first year, I believe, that they can put the teams on opposite sidelines because they've continued to reconfigure some things. So, and the Buckeyes will get there on Friday. They normally don't do Friday stadium walkthroughs, but because this is a unique experience and they want to know what they're walking into, they'll actually go check it out Friday when they land in Chicago. So they'll make that, 4-hour drive from the airport to Wrigleyville to check out the stadium and the confines there. And Ryan Day said on Tuesday that at halftime they'll just be going to the bullpen rather than like the locker room, and so they're going to show them where they'll be going there and all of that stuff. So it's a very unique thing, and there's been a little bit of talk about history, but more talk about just executing and things like that. All of the football stuff, but football's been going on at Wrigley for almost a century now. So this is nothing new, but it is certainly unique. It's going to be a bucket list item for yours truly. That's for sure.
Awesome. Most of those highlights, folks, that you see on YouTube now or saw with NFL Films back in the day with Gale Sayers and Dick Butkus, much of that at Wrigley Field, because Soldier Field, I know that Dick Butkus played until 71, and he played at Soldier Field for maybe a season or two. So all those highlights from the 60s and before, of course, at Wrigley Field. Tony, do you remember the odd configuration and the issue with the very first game at Wrigley, or the first modern game at Wrigley?
Right. And what was it? The wall was too close to the back of the end zone in one of those. So they just, once you got to the 50, you had to turn and basically play half court football. And that was unique for sure.
And it wasn't just that it was dangerous. The corner of the end zone actually went into the wall, and so it didn't even finish the corner. It was like kind of like just not by much, but maybe like a foot. It was rounded off. It was hilarious. So yeah, they would move. Everybody would kick off in the same direction. So the only issue was a scoop and score or pick six, and I guess nobody really monitored. Okay, if somebody's got a pick six, they're in the clear. They're not going to be run into the corner of the end zone. So
how did they think that was going to be okay?
I don't know. They had to have laid out the field well in advance. And again, we're not talking about something that happened in 1950. This was like 2005 or something like that.
I know that. Thank you for bringing me back. I think just as a history lesson, the Chicago Cardinals, I think, were the team that got to play at Soldier Field. So the Bears, up until 70 or 71, had 50 seasons at Wrigley Field, and they've now had 50 seasons at Soldier Field. So that's kind of a unique distinction that they played in two stadiums for 50 years each. But people don't really, there are very few people, old enough to remember that the Bears, played. I mean, you'd have to be in your 70s probably to remember that the Bears played at Wrigley Field, to have actively watched it. The field ran, I believe, from left field to home plate, whereas in this incarnation, it runs from home plate to right field. And in the 2010 game, you still had the third base dugout was there. What they did when they renovated the stadium is they made the third base dugout removable for special events like this. And now you can have an entire 100-yard football field. The issue was there was no buffer between the the inline, and you have that yard basically of white paint. There was no buffer behind the yard of white paint. So, you running a go route, to catch the ball in the back of the end zone, you're going to slam into the fence. Well, now they've at least got 6 feet behind each thing and padding, I presume, to protect the players who are running those kind of routes. I guess that's the only time something like this would come into play is when you're running routes into those end zones. And they just, in that 2010 game, Jim Delaney went out there and looked at it and said, he was the first one that raised the question and said, this isn't going to work. It's like that woman on the insurance company. It's not going to fit. Steven, it's not going to fit. And so they came up with the solution, very novel, to run every possession going toward home plate. So on a punt, they'd have to walk the ball all the way to the other end of the field and, go the other direction. So those poor people in the right field stands, they did get to see a defensive touchdown come their way in that game, but otherwise they were kind of, unless the ball was backed up at the 5-yard line, they didn't get much action in their end. So very interesting. And again, a slice of Americana, like the Rose Bowl, maybe Yankee Stadium, I don't know. But, I want to go down before the game if they'll let us and stand where home plate is and point out to right field like Babe Ruth did. And, that's one. Obviously, the Bears played there, and they won NFL championships playing there in the 50s, 60s, whatever. And this is a little-known thing that people don't recall, but Pete Rose tied the Ty Cobb record at Wrigley Field, and then he broke it at Cincinnati. So that was kind of a neat thing. And obviously, just recently, the Cubs and the Indians, before they became the Guardians, played in the World Series there. So I've probably been there 10 times for Cubs games, a few Reds Cubs games, maybe more than 10 times. And the neat thing about it is if you're going as a fan, typically you can go to the bars beforehand, go into the game, and then go back to the bars afterward and spend the entire day at Wrigleyville if you want. So a lot of good restaurants and bars right around. And the Cubs, or whoever their developer is, off the third base line, it used to just be a street. Well, they closed that part of the street and put in a new development over there with even more bars and restaurants to make it even better. So, it's just a fabulous place to go. I mean, the stadium, people who are used to all the amenities at the new stadiums will walk in and say, this is a dump. But then you realize you're at Wrigley Field. So, it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment or analyze Harry Carey's broadcasting ability because that would be mean. And may he rest in peace. He was a legend and an icon. So we'll put that aside because even from the age of 10 or 12, I was like, is this guy really good at what he does? Anyway.
Steve, look at all the Japanese.
It's Mark Gruzalanek. It's not that difficult to pronounce. Anyway, but to come home from school and to be able to flip on the Cubs, who just started at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, was just, there was few things better than that.
And in '84, when they were going for their first, playoff berth in a million years. They just kind of took the world by storm. 83, 84 was in that range. It may have been 83 was the year they got in the playoffs. I don't know, but
84.
84. Rick
Leon
Sutcliffe.
Durham right through his legs.
Leon Durham, Rick Sutcliffe, Ryan Sandberg. I think that
Bobby
was before
Dernier.
Bob Dernier. Yeah.
I think it was before Dunston.
Ron Say. Did you say
Ron
Ron
Say.
Say at third?
Keith Moreland.
I think he knocked in 90 runs. Keith Moreland.
Yeah.
Real Estate Moreland, I think, was
Mhm.
Chris Berman's
I
name for.
talking about Harry Carey, and one of my favorite
ahead.
things is Tony Perez Chica, pronouncing that, and then say how would you pronounce that backwards? And then like as the game is going on, he's trying to pronounce Perez Chica backwards, and it's like there's a screaming double to right field, and he's like as a Perez up, and it's like well,
they lose a game on a bases loaded, or they win the game on a bases loaded ball. Hey, he balked. Cubs win. Cubs win. It's like
That's
oh my
pretty
God.
good. That's pretty good.
Oh my God.
We will talk some football here eventually, folks. And my editor is going to watch this and say, finally talk some Ohio State. I need some clips here.
Mhm.
All right. But I got to get this in since we went there. Yes, the trade of June of 84 sent Rick Sutcliffe from my beloved Indians to the Cubs, who went 16-1 and won the Cy Young Award that year for Mel Hall and Joe Carter.
Yep.
Yeah. Who
Hey,
did pretty
Joe
well
Carter
for the Indians. Oh, yeah.
did well. Of course, then on to Toronto. They parlayed him onto Toronto for what? Ralamar and
Oh, that was a big trade.
yeah, that was a biggie. That was a
All
good
right,
one.
folks. Appreciate you being here. Leave those comments and questions. So the Buckeyes roll 45-0. You guys have probably long since forgotten about that game. I know I have to a certain extent, but throw that all together with what you learned this week from Ryan Day and the rest of the crew. What is big to look out for this week?
I'll jump in and just talk about the deep ball, the deep passing, which was not great again this past week. And Ryan Day was asked about it, and Chip Kelly was asked about it, and Will Howard was asked about it. And the consensus is that it's just footwork at this point, not getting set quickly enough to get some of those shots downfield. And so that's when the footwork is there, the ball is there. He just needs to get his feet set and cut it loose, basically, and try to overthrow receivers. And he said he tried to get a little too cute with the Carnell Tate thing, and then you saw it get hung up. I think at that point, the wind may have been blowing against that pass at that time, so that also didn't help. But I still think I go back to Ryan Day telling us 2 weeks or so ago that if Jeremiah Smith is running a route and he's even with the safety, just throw it as far as you can. Just go ahead. Doesn't matter what else is going on. Just throw it as far as you can because the safety's not going to stay with him. And so it's been, 9 games now, and Will Howard is still trying to process that. But I also think he's not necessarily seeing things as quickly as they're happening because he saw the Carnell Tate thing a little bit late. If he would have seen it earlier, he could have really stepped into that one. And, you can only throw the ball so far if you don't see it quickly enough. So I think getting set earlier, making sure that that's the read you're looking for, and just uncorking it, and you'll do okay. But, overall, he's completed 80% of his passes in 5 games this season. That's something that CJ Stroud never did. Dwayne Haskins never did it. Justin Fields never did it. Like, this is something that is incredibly rare at Ohio State. I don't know that anybody's ever done it. He's a 74% passer this year. He came into Ohio State as a 59% career passer. So we're absolutely nitpicking at this point with Will Howard. But when you get into these better games, you better hit the deep shots because those are free yards, and those might be the only touchdowns you get.
Yeah, my 2 cents was it was a workmanlike performance by Ohio State. I wanted to see them kind of come in and blow Purdue out of the water, and it was only 7-0 at the end of the first quarter, but business did pick up in the second quarter, 21-0. And instead of the Nebraska game where they let Nebraska hang around for 60 minutes, you didn't want to have that let down. You wanted to be up And Caden Curry provided some early juice with a blocked punt. They'd seen that Purdue was using smaller guys in the pass protectors, the guys behind the line of scrimmage in front of the punter. And they were able to put a couple bigger guys in there with some agility, Caden Curry and Mitchell Melton, to kind of shove those guys back into the rugby punter. And then Caden Curry was able to get off of that and block the punt. Ohio State had the ball at the 8-yard line. Yes, it took them 4 ill-advised plays to find the end zone. I think Howard carried on 3 of them, which is, maybe 2 too many. I don't know. But I love the last one, though. He faked the give to Judkins, who went through the hole over the right guard, which he probably would have scored standing up anyway, and then followed him in. So Judkins is now a blocker for him, and no doubt he scored standing up. So that was a tremendous play call, tremendous design, at least on that one. And as the game went on, I thought that Howard was very strong. I've harped for weeks about how you have to live with 2 galactically colossal mistakes by Will Howard week in and week out. He skipped that part this week and went right to effective, productive football. So that was good for him. Only missed on 5 passes, was sacked 1 time when he probably could have thrown the ball away. It was more of a coverage sack. But I felt that he played one of his better games. Jeremiah Smith, his fingerprints were all over this. Again, nice game for him. Travion Henderson had a huge game. And defensively, over the last 3 games, the teams have averaged 250 yards. So that's what Penn State, Nebraska, and Purdue, or whatever order that was in. And then I guess it would have been Nebraska, Penn State, Purdue was the order. 250 yards over the last 3 games. And those 3 teams have scored a combined 30 points. And 7 of those was on a pick 6 by Penn State that wasn't even against the Ohio State defense. So their defense has given up 23 points in 3 games, which is just shy of 8 points a game. You're going to win a lot of football games when your defense only gives up 8 points a game. In fact, you're going to win about 99.9% of the games that you play when you only give up 8 points. So to me, it feels like this team is really starting to come together. This was a much better performance, albeit against a really bad Purdue team, than what we saw against Nebraska. And there was no let up. There was no nothing that made you scratch your head and say, well, what are they doing that for? Plus, in the second half, they got a ton of guys, great reps. Like JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer played one of their best games ever. And according to the snap count I saw, they each only were in like the mid-20s in snap count. That's what everybody's been dying for. Keep those guys to the 30 most important plays that you need them for and get great production for those 30 plays, and then let some other fresh guys play. And, boy, they probably had a bigger impact on that game playing 30 plays than they did in most games where they play 60. So those were some of my takeaways from it. Very positive, hard to come away with anything, and took care of business. And obviously, when 3 and 4 lose in the playoff rankings with Georgia and Miami, you've solidified your spot at number 2. You're not coming out of there anytime soon, barring a terrible performance or a loss. And it's all set up on the table for them: Northwestern, Indiana, Michigan, and potentially Oregon again. I don't know what the tiebreaker is between Penn State and Indiana, since they, I guess, don't play each other. I get maybe it's records of their, Big Ten opponents, perhaps. I don't know. But Indiana, for all intents and purposes, will come to Ohio State next week playing for a spot in the Big Ten championship game, because you have to assume they're going to go back home in the final week and beat Purdue just like Ohio State just did. So they're going to end up, with undefeated if they beat Ohio State, and they would go in as an undefeated Big Ten team if they beat Ohio State, obviously. So they are playing for a spot in the championship game next week. And they've had, up until this past week, it's been just, one easy win after another. Michigan, I know, Tony, you probably studied it much closer than I did, but Michigan played a great second half and made them earn it. But that's kind of where we're at right now. Don't want to get caught looking too far ahead to Indiana, but that is one subplot of that game next week. Indiana's not just playing to get to 11-0 and maybe get to the playoffs or whatever. They're playing for a shot at their a realistic shot at their first Big Ten championship since 1967. So that's some pretty heady stuff too.
One of the interesting things to watch with Indiana is if they do lose to Ohio State, how bad the loss is. They'll get credit for a good loss. They'll be punished for a bad loss, and it might be punished enough that a 2-loss SEC team keeps them out of the playoffs.
Well, Comrade Dinich is already on ESPN stumping for 3-loss SEC teams over, I presume, a 1-loss Indiana with no resume. So other than the loss to Ohio State, they would really not even have a quality win. So that's their quality win is a loss at Ohio State. So
they don't have a ranked win at this point. Texas doesn't have a ranked win at this point, but they would over Texas A&M. But if in the SEC, if all of the favored teams win, basically you're looking at LSU in the SEC championship game, which that's a 3-loss team. So if they win that one, that's going to make things even more confusing. And so it is interesting that you've got a 12-team playoff, and it's like, how can anybody complain if they don't make it? You've had a chance. You've had your opportunities to make it. But all of these teams are just like, I think I said it last night during our live show, everything from like 3 to 15 is just all smashed in there, and you can just rearrange it any way you want and see if there's anything in there. And then just wait until SMU comes screaming into the picture even more, or Army beats Notre Dame, and now you've got Army and Boise State, fighting for that final spot. I think it's fascinating.
Or if anybody, namely Colorado, beats BYU in the Big 12 championship game. But you brought up a good one, Tony, that people are just starting, I think, to catch on to is the LSU path to the SEC championship game, because people tend to look at overall record. Oh, they lost their third game, they're done. No, 2 losses, and everybody's in play. 2 losses, and Texas A&M, the only teams in the conference with 1 loss. That is a crazy log jam. And you're right. If Indiana's sitting, for all the talk about analyzing the 14 playoff and then transposing that into the 12 team to say, well, if you go 10-2, you're an automatic. That's the dividing line, especially if you're in the Big Ten, that Indiana could run into this log jam of 10-2 teams whose resumes are almost indistinguishable between each other. If Ohio State gives them like a 41-14 beatdown,
because all of the teams they'll be compared against have at least a good ranked win generally, and Indiana won't have any of that. So then it comes down to, does the committee prefer how dominating they've been? Well, they weren't dominating against Michigan. And if they lose to Ohio State, they weren't dominating in that one. So who did they actually dominate? They dominated a bunch of teams that are any of them going to a bowl game? Maybe, but it's not a good schedule that they've played. And so if a committee wants to, if they believe that these other teams are better, then they would keep Indiana out. Now, they did say last night on the teleconference, they don't, because an SEC writer called in and was like, how could you possibly look at these Big Ten teams and not see that the SEC head-to-head would beat each of them? He's like, well, we don't look at head-to-head. So they won't look at Alabama versus Indiana. They'll just look at body of work and what have you done. And I think there may have been the same person or somebody else saying, it's like, don't you understand? Like, these losses are to SEC teams. Aren't you looking at the strength of schedule? Like, when you see these losses, don't you understand that they're 2 good teams? And so, should they really count?
I will argue resume all day. I'm a resume guy, and I get the SEC is the best conference and still playing the best top to bottom. It's not necessarily the best at the top. I would argue that the Big Ten, I would certainly send those 2 out against anybody. But anyway, I get that. But when somebody makes a moronic comment like, well, can't you see that they would just win that game? No, we can't see it, because haven't you watched college football before? We don't know if Nebraska played Vanderbilt that they would necessarily lose that game. We have no idea who would win that game.
I think it's interesting that Georgia, who everybody had number 1, is on the outside looking in as of today. They would be, the first team out. And, it's because Boise State, who's outside the top 12, has to get the 12 seed if they're the highest ranking group of 5 champion, which I don't have a real problem with. I mean, we've never once argued that team number 12 should have had a legitimate shot at the national championship. They've played their way out of it. And, much to what that questioner on that teleconference said, the flip side, that I look at, I mean, it's the assumption that because it's SEC, it's great, but Alabama, Georgia, and Ole Miss, as great as they might be playing right now, or they did play on one specific day, like when Georgia put it all together one day and beat Texas, they haven't played at that level on a consistent basis all season. So we can't just assume that if a team shows up with that black G on the side of their helmet, that they're going to beat Indiana in a neutral stadium. We can't assume that. I mean, maybe they win 55, 60% of them, but Indiana's going to win a few of them too. I mean, by all things being equal, as long as they don't turn it over 5 times or something stupid. Yeah, I just kind of look at it that it's all apples to oranges comparisons, unfortunately. And, it's not like the NFL where you have a lot of common opponents, or you're in a division, you play each other twice, or, it's very easy to set one team ahead of the other when it comes time to seed the playoffs. It's very easy in the NFL. There's a protocol, well, when you have 135 teams going for 12 spots, there is no apples and oranges comparison to any of it. It's too bad that the middle to bottom of the Big Ten, the bottom has kind of dropped out of that. You had teams that were kind of on a promising run, like Minnesota had won 4 games in a row, and then they go to Rutgers and lose to a Rutgers team that had lost 4 games in a row. I mean, otherwise, here's Minnesota could end up with 9 wins at the end of the year potentially, and, borderline top 25 team, to give somebody else a little bit of credit for beating, one of these other 14 teams in the Big Ten, but, very little of that, those wins are going to count for much of anything, because they're all going to end up right around 6-6, 5-7, 7-5, and, and then Purdue at 1-11. But, it is what it is, I guess. I'm not going to worry about that. I think that there is something to be said for going coast to coast or 2 time zones over and winning a game and staying with 1 loss. And, here's the question I have as we watch this Saturday. Wisconsin's had kind of a rough season, losing at home 2 touchdowns to Penn State, got beat by 32 at Iowa, have been off this past week to kind of lick their wounds. And can they give Oregon a 4-quarter game? Does Oregon go in there fat and happy and, off of a tougher than expected game against Maryland this past week? It wasn't necessarily a 4-quarter game, but they had to keep hitting and tackling in the 4th quarter, to win that one. So to me, is that an upset alert? I think the line on that's like 2 touchdowns. Does Wisconsin somehow conjure its best game of the season and make that a 4-quarter game? That'll be interesting.
Yeah, I think what the committee is going to default to, or at least this is their history, is not necessarily let's line up these resumes and, your 6th best win is better than their 6th win. That's the tiebreaker. There we go. But they're going to have a good excuse with Indiana based on 2 things if this transpires. Number 1, you had 1 opportunity against a playoff caliber elite team and you got blown out. So you've got nothing else to go on. You had 1 opportunity, you got blown out. If they get blown out. Number 2, you had an opportunity to schedule somebody outside the conference. You scheduled no one. You had that opportunity. Everybody else, not named Ohio State, scheduled somebody. And when you look at the SEC, they pretty much, outside of a game or 2, took care of business when they went outside the conference. So once they step inside the conference and start to win these games against each other, they can all point to, well, Alabama beat Wisconsin and Georgia beat Clemson and Georgia Tech and so forth and so on. Most of them stepped outside the conference and did what they needed to do outside the conference.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Florida International, Eastern Illinois, and Charlotte is the Indiana non-conference schedule. So good luck being rewarded for that. And we'll talk about game control and all of that. But if there are no good wins, because Ohio State's getting credit for a good loss, 1-point loss at Oregon. If Indiana can't get a good win and can't get a good loss to get credit for, because a 7-point, a 1-score loss at Ohio State is probably enough to keep them in the playoffs. Anything outside of that, and then you start to get a little like, okay, now we got to compare things, and who's your best win? And if you both have losses, like, then once you get a loss, you start giving the committee room to find other flaws and to find other things they like about other teams. And 2 good wins and 2 quality losses is better than no good wins and a quality loss.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought as the bracket came out yesterday, it was kind of interesting. Ohio State, if they lose to Oregon, would they hang on and still be the 5 seed, which is kind of interesting, because if they were and Oregon remains the 1 seed, then they could potentially play again in the semifinals if it came down to that. But Ohio State would have to win 2 games to get there, which would be Boise State, the 12 seed, at home in Columbus, and then advancing to play Miami. That game would be played in Atlanta at the Peach Bowl, because the Orange Bowl is one of the semifinals. Otherwise, the ACC champion would go to the Orange Bowl. But I think that they put it out there that the ACC champion this year would go to the Peach Bowl. And so it will be, I guess, Ohio State, Miami in the Peach Bowl. And then you would have to play Oregon, presumably in the Cotton Bowl semifinal, because that's closer to Oregon than sending them clear to Orange Bowl in Miami. And, that'd be your path as of now. Now, if you did beat Oregon and they replaced Oregon with Ohio State as the 1 seed, then you're looking, what Oregon's looking at. You'd play the winner of Notre Dame and Tennessee in the Rose Bowl, would be kind of cool. And then in the semifinal, play the winner of Miami, Oregon, and Boise State. So you'd have that rematch with Oregon, but potentially could that be in the Orange Bowl instead of the Cotton Bowl? Interesting. But it's kind of an all or nothing prospect here for Ohio State. And, on one hand, it'd be kind of cool to play a home game against Boise State, but at the other hand, it's much, much easier to skip straight to the quarterfinal round and take your chances from there. Rose Bowl, Orange Bowl, or Cotton Bowl, and then the national championship. I think it's in Atlanta. Does that sound correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
So we can drive to that if we had to, if need be. Driving through the snow in the mountains, that sounds like a lot of fun. Didn't you drive to the one and you had bad traffic or weather? The Georgia one?
Oh, I don't even
traffic or
remember.
weather?
Probably traffic. We haven't run into too much weather. Traffic is generally an issue.
Yeah, I think Chattanooga was all boogered up.
The interesting thing, one of the interesting things is just for Buckeye fans to keep in mind, I believe the Peach Bowl is a 12 p.m. kickoff. So just assume Ohio State will end up there somehow. We did mention the possibility of, like, what would it take to get Ohio State to host a first round game against Miami in December in Ohio Stadium? I think that would be pretty cool.
That would be cool
to see that. But every week they shuffle this a little bit, and you see more stuff that you want to see, and then you see it again the next week. It's like, I would also like to see this. And Alabama, Indiana would be fantastic. It may not. Alabama would go in there as favorites, which I think I don't know if anybody wants to dispute that. But that would be an incredible crowd, an incredible opportunity for that crowd, who generally gets an Ohio State or a Penn State or a Michigan, and 60% of the crowd is visiting fans. This would be an opportunity for the home fans to keep those tickets and support their team and be as loud as possible.
Yep. Ole Miss and Penn State, that we've seen those 2 teams play here in recent years. I think didn't the visiting team win both those games? Does that sound right?
No, you're thinking about Auburn.
Auburn. Okay. Well, they played Ole Miss in the bowl game.
They played the bowl game last year, the Peach Bowl.
Yeah, and Ole Miss won, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah. On that topic of the noon games, which has been heavy discussion, And the SID from Ohio State once, was actively asking reporters to write about the noon starts because Ohio State, must be feeling they're leaving money on the table by having all these noon starts. They're not able to sell booze all day, I guess, or whatever their big bugaboo about this is. But the fans certainly want the ability to tailgate all day. But excuse me, looking to next year, this is not changing. And we can assure you if Fox gets the first 3 picks, the first pick will be Ohio State, Michigan. The second pick will be Texas at Ohio State in week 1, noon. You can already book your travel in regards to that. And the third one will be Penn State, Ohio State, whatever week that they set that one up. So you can rest assured that the 2 biggest home games of next season will be at noon, and the game at Michigan will be at noon. And as I looked at it, their one chance for a marquee home night game could be UCLA, which makes perfect sense because Big Noon typically you wouldn't think would take a West Coast team at 12 o'clock because people are, just getting out of bed out there at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and you're cutting your audience on the West Coast if you don't play that game until what would it be, 12:30 or 4:30 Pacific time. So to me, that makes perfect sense that that would be your night game possibility, UCLA, for next year.
Shouldn't we be getting the dates? I thought we were anytime now.
Yeah, Jerry said he thought anytime, and that was 2 or 3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And love to know those dates so we can lock in some hotels in Wisconsin in particular. We already know the date for Michigan, pretty obviously. It'll be Thanksgiving Saturday, but some of the other ones that we travel to would be interesting. I've got the schedule here, at least who they're playing. Oh, at Purdue, at Wisconsin, at Washington, at Illinois. Hotel's usually not a problem for Illinois, Purdue, and Washington's such a big city that, it's not going to matter. Stay out by the airport, whatever, it'll be fine. But that one at Wisconsin, I'd like to stay in Madison if at all humanly possible. And if I know the date before they know the date, then that makes it that much easier.
I know they had UCLA play the big noon game at Penn State, so there's an exception. Your theory, Steve, makes total sense. I totally agree with it, but there was that game. Maybe with the California crowd, they're actually thinking, we'll get them out of bed and they can watch a football game before they get on with the rest of their day because they're not stopping the rest of their day to watch football. So we might catch them in the morning.
People that watch UCLA anyway, so
Yeah, this 8-9 decision by the committee, that's going to be a crucial one. When you're talking about, are we going to play this game in Tuscaloosa or play it in Bloomington or whatever 2 teams land in the 8-9 spot, that's going to be the one where the resumes are going to be razor thin, razor close. Even the 7-10 could be extremely close. And the committee making a determination of, okay, we're going to send somebody to Bloomington, Indiana, or to Penn State versus we're going to send them to Knoxville or Tuscaloosa is going to be enormous.
Yeah, it's going to be fun watching that argument of these are the 2 closest teams in the top 12 basically, and it's like, well, why do they get the home game and we don't? And there'll be answers for both of those, because I think what the committee normally does is they group them by 3, so it's 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9. So it's like all of those are grouped in together when they're trying to figure out, okay, where should we put this group? How should we, who is the better team? Who should, and then, as you said, they're determining who gets that home game. And it's going to be by the finest of margins, and it's going to be opinion. And the road team's going to be upset. But, hey, you're in the playoffs. This is what you wanted. And if we always just go back to the start of the season, like everybody is happy and agrees that it's a good thing that 12 teams make the playoffs and that 4 teams get home games. So let's all agree that this is a good thing. So when something you don't like happens to you in December, remember you wanted this. You accepted this. You accepted what could happen, what was going to happen, or what may happen. And so it won't make them feel better, but it's like, hey, it's better than it's better than just a Final Four, isn't it? Like, would you rather be playing in the playoffs on the road or playing in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. Like there's no comparison.
You also wonder if they'll maybe nudge somebody off of a certain spot if they're going to play a rematch.
Yeah, and they say they won't, but I don't necessarily believe them, because say Notre Dame and Tennessee have played before, why not move one of them to 10 and move 10 to 9 or whatever, and just to avoid that. Like, they're not going to look too far down the line, and I don't think they care that Ohio State and Oregon would have to play a third time in that top half of the bracket.
Sure.
But if you can avoid a first round rematch and you can justify it, then I think they should do that. And they'll say they won't, but I'm sure TV would like that as well. And this is a TV driven thing. Unless that was the highest ranked game of the season. If that was like a top 5 game, then maybe the TV is like, yeah, we'll take a rematch. But I know we would all probably like to avoid that. And I don't think we would get too upset if there's just a little bit of a tweak from the committee to avoid rematches right out of the gate.
Hey,
Most
Tony,
likely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
just back on Ohio State, Indiana real quick. Did you watch the Indiana-Michigan game closely as you were doing your Michigan?
I did as well. Every play.
What was it that Michigan did in the second half? Indiana only scored 3 points, I think, they were up 17-3 or
17
6
and a half. And they only had about they had negative 6 yards of total offense until their final scoring drive, which was born from a bad punt and a good punt return. And they had like a 10-yard drive and kicked a field goal to make it 20-15. They were just getting beat at the line of scrimmage by Michigan's defense. And this was a little surprising for me based on what we expected to see from Indiana. So this game told me a heck of a lot more about Indiana than it told me about Michigan, because this was the Michigan we've seen all season long. They still only had like 250 yards of total offense, but they beat up on Indiana's front, and they got after Curtis Rourke. They sacked him, I think, 3 or 4 times, made life difficult for him. He threw a bad interception inside his own 10-yard line, and they just made life difficult on that Indiana offense. They held Indiana to like 40 yards rushing, and they won at the point of attack all game long, other than maybe like initially when Indiana was moving the ball. Indiana could have scored more, though. Mark, you saw the drops that they were having with the receivers were having. Elijah Surratt dropping some passes that he normally doesn't. So this shouldn't have been so close, but the fact that it was, and that Michigan limited them as much as they did, should be encouraging for Ohio State fans.
Yeah, if Michigan had any kind of offense, and I was on Steve Dace's show yesterday trying to give whatever analysis I've got on Michigan's offense, but my goodness, their longest running play was 8 yards. Mm-hmm. Can't you scheme up? I know that's when people talk schemes, they usually talk passing game, but shoot, Michigan was the masters of the run game and offensive line coordination in the run game, and they could only get 8 yards for their best run between Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards, going for 25 carries between them. They had a 1st and goal at the 6, and they had a 1st and goal at the 7, and they couldn't score a touchdown. Their touchdown drive was 34 yards, and they got a 15-yard personal foul. So they had a 19-yard touchdown drive. That was their best drive.
God.
It took them forever to get into the end zone, too. 7 plays, 19 yards. Mm-hmm. It's just painful. But, yeah, they really clamped down in the second half defensively. Well, in addition to the -6, I was just going to say Indiana 25 plays in the second half, 18 yards.
I want to sit here and say this is going to be like the game 4 years ago, the COVID year, which was so dysfunctional. And both teams were 4-0 when they played at Ohio Stadium, and it was like the East Division Championship game. The winner of that game was going to go and to the championship game. And Ohio State led Indiana 28-7 at halftime. And then Michael Penix Jr. just caught – he got red hot, and he ended up with 491 yards passing. And Ohio State held on and won the game 42-35. Justin Fields kind of matched him, throw for throw on the other side. But I don't think we're going to have that this time, just because Ohio State's defense is playing at a level, I would say, close to what Michigan defense did against Indiana. So they're going to hold Indiana, to no more than 25 points, I would think, in that range, maybe fewer, based on how well they're playing right now. And if Ohio State can get to 30, maybe they win the game. The line I'm seeing is like 9.5. Maybe they win that game 31-21 or 31-17. But I just question whether Indiana is going to be able to do it at Ohio State against the Ohio State defense. That's now that we've seen Indiana sputter on offense once against by far the best defense it's seen all season, by a wide margin. What does that translate? And I'm sure they're putting this 2 weeks to good use to take the parts of the playbook that didn't work against Michigan out and insert new wrinkles that are going to confound Jim Knowles on that obligatory first drive, 14 plays, 80 yards, 7.5 minutes. And, either they get 3 or they get 7. But, Knowles always seems to give against the good teams, always seems to give up that early one where they're still calibrating, and they're still trying to figure out, okay, that's where the ball is going to be today. So now we've got to go find it. But as I said, his defense has played lights out. Not that Nebraska, Penn State, and Purdue are certainly the 1921 Yankees when it comes to offensive ability, but it's good to get stops when you get them, no doubt about it. And to slam the door on people in the red zone the way that they have too. I mean, they get credit for another inside the 10-yard line stop this past week when Purdue missed like a 15-yard field goal or whatever that was. I've never seen that before. A guy missed a 20-yard field goal or 21 or whatever it was.
Well, Ohio State has one of the nation's best field goal defense. I think we could all agree with that. Special teams are picking up at the right time. They're forcing missed field goals somehow. I think it's interesting. They wanted to block a punt. They did it. They're trying to get something out of their return game. They're putting Emeka Ibuka. They're putting Travion Henderson back on kickoffs. They've put Caleb Downs back on punt. So they're trying to do something. So it'll be interesting to see as they try to do that, will it result in something? Because, again, the last kickoff return for a touchdown was 2010. The last punt return for a touchdown, I believe, was 2014. So they're due.
Against Indiana, right? Jalen Marshall?
Correct. Yep. And the kickoff return was against Michigan, Jordan Hall.
Oh, yeah. Jordan Hall. Nice.
Blast from the past. Speaking of blasts from the past, it has been 20 years since Ohio State last lost to Northwestern. That was 2004. And behind me, I had them playing behind me, and Northwestern 19-7 over Ohio State. So go ahead and get your bets in on that one.
Yeah. No doubt.
They can't come up with a final score of that game.
It's like 33-24 or something.
33-27.
Because 33-7 popped into my mind, but that was Iowa.
That was Iowa. I think it was 33-27 was the overtime game.
Oh,
maybe.
Yeah. That's it.
Noah Herron running the ball. 33-27, yes. October 2nd.
Very good, Steve.
Yeah. I can remember the scores from 20 years ago better than I can one from 2 weeks ago.
No doubt. No doubt. Appreciate you being here, everyone. Catch Ohio State live on your favorite audio platform if you want to go that route. We strip off the audio. We post it on Apple, Amazon, Google Play, whatever else is out there, Spotify. So you can listen to us as well. Tony, what's going on at Buckeye Huddle and the Buckeye Weekly podcast?
Yeah, I dropped the Buckeye Weekly podcast last night, our live reaction to the CFP rankings and a ton of questions answered there from the live stream viewers. We'll be dropping our bold prediction show at some point tomorrow, and then we'll be previewing the game from Chicago. And I'll have a notebook up from stuff that we heard yesterday from the coaches, from Ryan Day, and talking about Maurice Clarett being around the program now, talking about some of the changes they've tried to make with the turf, or alluding to changes they've tried to make with the turf. And so I'll have that out later this afternoon.
So I guess that's going to be the mark of a successful game against Northwestern, Will Howard not falling down at any point in the game, just out of nowhere.
Yeah, they're practicing on grass this week because that's what they'll be playing on. But we've seen, if you've looked at past pictures of the past games at Wrigley with the sod that they throw on, there's some big chunks coming up there as well, reminiscent of the 2006 Ohio State-Michigan game, if you remember those landmines.
So everybody's going to be falling down on Saturday. So Will Howard's going to fall down about 5 times. Although I'm guessing there's going to be much scrutiny about his new cleats. Like people are going to try to spot whether he's got new cleats this week.
And will he save those for the home game or, because you're going to need different cleats for different turf. So they'll have their grass cleats out for this week.
Steve, what are you working on this week?
They need the Tennessee cleats from 1997.
Whatever's going to grip the surface the best is what I would say is what they need to go to. But this new turf at Ohio State has been a dud. I think everybody can agree on that. I mean, I want to go back on I write down most every play and how many times I've ever written slipped, over the course of the season. It's been quite a bit. And it's not just confined to Howard. When you throw a pass to a running back coming out of the backfield and they've got to try and cut on a dime or something like that after they make the catch, we've seen a lot of those guys go down after making the catch, out in the flat or whatever, or a quick swing or whatever, where they're trying to change direction, as they're catching the ball. And it's too much. That turf can't handle it. So, I don't know what else can be said other than they need to rip that one up and get something better in there because they're not getting the performance that they paid for out of that turf. It's just pretty much a certainty there. But working on football and basketball. Ohio State played Youngstown State Monday night. They're going to play a big one Friday night. I'll be finding a bar in Chicago to watch Ohio State play at Texas A&M 9:00 Eastern time on Friday. With football, got my game data page coming out today. The picks for the weekend coming up as well. Big game with Georgia and Tennessee. And, a third loss for Georgia would be detrimental. But, has Tennessee got what it takes to pull that one out? I'm not sure what to think about that one. It's like which of these teams is going to show up on a given basis. But, just more of the same. And, of course, next week we're going to have the first of 2 weeks where you blow out the budget coverage, Indiana, the big one, and then Michigan, the big one, the one after that. So, it's things about to get real interesting in these parts. And if you win both of those, then you're going on to play Oregon in the really, really big one. So 1 versus 2, I can remember a 1 versus 2 Alabama, Florida SEC championship game with Urban and Saban back in like the late 2000s, like 09, 08, 07, somewhere in there. But it's been, very rare to have that type of game in a conference championship game. So we'll hopefully get to see that in a few weeks as well.
Yeah, it was actually back-to-back years.
Okay, 1 versus 2.
08, Urban won. Florida then won the national championship. 09, Bama won, and then they went on and won the national championship. Speaking of which, Disputed National Champions, grab the link. It's in the description section. Check it out right there. Thanks for the segment.
What years are you covering with that? Just 90
This is the 1990s.
Awesome.
But we're also, playing it out in future generations. Tony, Steve, appreciate you being here. As always, Buckeyes Live, everyone, and enjoy the game on Saturday.